What if the people we call Nubians today are only the latest chapter of a story that began thousands of years before Egypt became a kingdom? And what if ancient DNA has now revealed that the real story is far more complicated than the one we were taught? If you think you already know where the Nubians came from, stay with me, because by the end of this story, you may never look at the Nile Valley the same way again. And if forgotten human stories matter to you, take a moment to subscribe, because this is one of those stories where the bones are finally speaking for themselves. For centuries, Nubia has stood in the shadow of Egypt. When people hear the word Nubia, many immediately imagine the great pyramids of Sudan, dark-skinned warriors, ancient kings, desert kingdoms, and a civilization living somewhere south of Egypt. And that picture is not completely wrong, but it is incomplete. Because Nubia was never just one kingdom. It was never just one tribe. And it was never one simple bloodline moving unchanged through thousands of years. Nubia was a huge region along the Nile, stretching through parts of what are now southern Egypt and northern Sudan. It became home to different cultures and powerful kingdoms across different periods. There was Kerma, there was Kush, there was Napata, there was Meroë, and later there were Christian Nubian kingdoms that survived for centuries. These people traded with Egypt. They fought Egypt. They married people from neighboring lands. They conquered Egypt. They were conquered by Egypt. They worshipped different gods at different times. They changed languages. They changed religions. They changed political systems. Yet through all these changes, one question has remained strangely difficult to answer. Who were the Nubians really? For a long time, historians had to depend on pottery, buildings, inscriptions, paintings, skeletons, and burial customs. Those clues could tell us how people lived. They could tell us what they ate. They could tell us what they believed. But they could not directly show us the genetic story hidden inside their bodies. Ancient DNA changed that, and one of the most important breakthroughs came from a place called Kulubnarti, an ancient settlement in Nubia, located in what is now Sudan. The environment there is extremely hot and dry. That might sound helpful for preserving ancient remains, but there's a problem. Heat is one of the enemies of DNA. Over time, it destroys genetic material. That is one reason ancient DNA from Africa has been much harder to recover than many people realize. For years, researchers had very few ancient genomes from the Nile Valley. Then came the breakthrough. Researchers were able to study genome-wide DNA from 66 people who lived in Christian period Nubia, roughly between the 7th and 10th centuries. Suddenly, scientists were no longer looking at one skeleton. They were looking at an entire ancient community. And the results were fascinating. The people of Kulubnarti carried a major ancestry component related to ancient populations from the Nile Valley and East Africa. But they also carried ancestry related to populations farther north, ultimately connected through Egypt to groups with ancestry similar to people from the ancient Levant. In the study, the Kulubnarti population was modeled as having about 43% Nilotic-related ancestry, with individual variation, while much of the remaining ancestry was connected to West Eurasian-related ancestry that appears to have entered through Egypt. That finding immediately creates a problem for simple stories, because if someone tells you ancient Nubians were completely isolated from the outside world, the DNA does not support that. But if someone tells you Nubians were simply outsiders who arrived from somewhere else and replaced an earlier population, the DNA does not support that either. The truth is more interesting. They were connected, they were local, they were African. And they were part of a Nile Valley world that had been exchanging people and genes for a very long time. This is our first major clue. The Nubian story was not about purity. It was about movement. And that makes sense when you look at the geography. The Nile is not simply a river. For thousands of years, it was a road. Imagine standing beside it thousands of years ago. Behind you is the Sahara. Ahead of you is another stretch of river. The desert makes travel difficult. The Nile makes it possible. People could move north. People could move south. Goods could move. Ideas could move. Languages could move. Religions could move. And people moved with them. This means Nubia sat in one of the most important human crossroads on Earth. To the north was Egypt. To the south were regions connected to the deeper African interior. To the east were routes toward the Red Sea, and beyond those routes was Arabia and the wider Near Eastern world. Nubia was never at the edge of history. It was in the middle of it. But there is another surprise. The genetic mixture found in medieval Nubia was not simply the result of one recent invasion. The evidence suggests that some of the ancestry connected to populations farther north had already become part of Nubian communities long before the Islamic period. That matters because modern stories often make the timeline much simpler than it really was. People sometimes imagine that Nubians were one ancient population. Then outsiders arrived. Then everything changed. Ancient DNA tells us the story had already been unfolding for centuries. The Nile had been connecting north and south long before later Arab migrations. And this is where the mystery gets deeper, because the people living in Nubia during the Christian period were not the beginning of Nubian history. They were standing on top of an ancient world that was already thousands of years old. Long before churches stood along the Nile, before Christianity arrived, before Islam, before the pyramids of Meroë became symbols of Sudan, there were communities building their lives along this river. One of the most important was Kerma. Kerma rose in Upper Nubia and became the center of a powerful state. Its relationship with Egypt was complicated. Sometimes there was trade, sometimes there was conflict, and sometimes the balance of power shifted dramatically. Egyptians often looked south toward Nubia because Nubia had things Egypt wanted: gold, livestock, stone, luxury goods, and access to trade routes leading deeper into Africa. But Nubians also wanted things from the north. The relationship was never simply one civilization looking down on another. It was a relationship between neighboring worlds. And sometimes the southern kingdom became powerful enough to turn the relationship upside down. That happened under Kush. At its height, the kingdom of Kush became one of the most powerful states in northeastern Africa. And then came one of the most astonishing moments in ancient African history. Kushite kings moved north. They conquered Egypt. For a period in the 8th century BCE, Kushite rulers controlled Egypt and became pharaohs. Think about what that means. The civilization that is so often presented as the center of the ancient Nile world was, for a time, ruled by kings from the south. The Nubian pharaohs were not some footnote. They were part of Egypt's royal history. Their monuments remain. Their names remain. Their pyramids remain. And yet, for a long time, their story was pushed into the background. Why? Part of the answer lies in how history was written. Ancient Egypt attracted enormous attention from European explorers and scholars. Its temples were famous. Its pyramids were enormous. Its writing system became one of archaeology's greatest prizes. Nubia had extraordinary monuments too, but many were less known to the outside world. And when the history of Egypt was told, Nubia was often described mainly as Egypt's southern neighbor. That framing can quietly change how we see an entire civilization. Instead of asking what Nubia created, people asked what Nubia received from Egypt. Instead of seeing two connected civilizations, people sometimes imagined a powerful north and a lesser south. But the archaeological record does not fit that simple picture. Kush developed its own political traditions. It had its own writing system. It developed its own artistic styles. It created its own religious traditions. And it built hundreds of pyramids in what is now Sudan. The story of Nubia is therefore not a story of people waiting for civilization to arrive from somewhere else. It is a story of a civilization developing within Africa while constantly interacting with its neighbors. And the DNA adds another layer. It shows that these interactions were not only cultural, they were biological too. People were not simply exchanging pottery and gold. They were creating families, and families leave traces. But here is where we need to be careful. DNA cannot tell us someone's entire identity. It cannot tell us what language a person spoke. It cannot tell us which god they prayed to. It cannot tell us whether they personally thought of themselves as Nubian, Egyptian, Kushite, Christian, or something else. Genes are not culture. They are one piece of the story. And that distinction is incredibly important, because there is a temptation to look at ancient DNA and say, there is the answer. But DNA does not give us one answer. It gives us another set of clues. And sometimes those clues force historians to ask better questions. So what did the ancient Nubians actually look like? This is another place where modern assumptions can become dangerous. Ancient people did not fit neatly into the racial categories we use today. Human populations existed across wide geographic regions. They moved, they mixed, they separated, they came together again. And the Nile Valley was especially complex. A person living near the northern cataracts might have different ancestry from someone living farther south. A person living during Kerma might have a different genetic profile from someone living during Meroë. A Christian period Nubian might differ from someone living centuries earlier. So when we say the Nubians, we're really talking about many populations across many centuries. That may be the biggest lesson of the DNA. There was no single Nubian genetic formula. There was no one bloodline. There was a long changing population shaped by geography, migration, marriage, trade, war, and survival. And if you are enjoying the mystery so far, remember this. The most surprising part is not that Nubians had mixed ancestry. The surprising part is how old some of those connections appear to be, and what that tells us about the Nile as a human highway. Because we have not reached the deepest layer yet. There is another question. Where did the different ancestral streams actually come from? This is where the science becomes fascinating. The researchers studying Kulubnarti found that the northern or West Eurasian related ancestry was disproportionately associated with female lines. In simple terms, the genetics pattern suggests that women connected to populations farther north played an important role in introducing that ancestry into the community. This does not mean every woman came from Egypt. It does not mean Nubian society was controlled by outsiders. And it certainly does not mean ancient Nubians stopped being African. It means that over generations, people from different parts of the Nile, the world became connected through family. And that connection could happen in many ways: marriage, migration, movement of households, political alliances, trade, war, or simple human choices that left no written record. Imagine one woman arriving in a Nubian village hundreds of years ago. We will never know her name. We may never know where exactly she was born. We may never know why she moved. Maybe she married into a local family. Maybe her family had already been living in the Nile Valley for generations. Maybe she came from farther north. Maybe the movement happened through a chain of families so ordinary that nobody at the time considered it historically important. But centuries later, a tiny piece of her genetic inheritance may still be visible. That is the strange power of ancient DNA. It can turn an invisible human life into historical evidence. The woman who left no inscription can still leave a genetic footprint. The farmer whose name disappeared can still tell us something. The child buried beside the Nile can still challenge a modern theory. And suddenly, history becomes personal. It stops being only about kings. It becomes about ordinary people. This is also why the Kulubnarti discovery matters beyond Nubia. Researchers found that the people buried in two cemeteries showed genetic similarities, even though archaeological evidence suggested social differences between the groups. In other words, people could be socially divided without being genetically separate. Several pairs of close relatives were even found across the two cemeteries. Think about that. Two groups may have lived differently. They may have had different levels of wealth. They may have been treated differently after death. But their DNA says they were part of the same connected community. That is a powerful reminder that social class is not the same thing as biological ancestry. A cemetery can show hierarchy. DNA can show family. And together, they can reveal a much more human picture. Now comes another twist. What happened after the Christian period? This is where the story moves closer to the Nubians living today. Researchers compared the ancient Kulubnarti genomes with genetic data from several modern Nubian populations. And they found something important. The modern groups tested could not simply be treated as direct descendants of the Kulubnarti population without additional ancestry entering their gene pools later. Genetic dating also pointed to later admixture events that fit broadly with periods of movement following the Arab conquest and later migrations along the Nile. That means modern Nubians are not frozen versions of one medieval population. Their history continued. New people arrived. Old communities changed. Families mixed. Some people moved north, some moved south. And the genetic story kept evolving. This should not be seen as a loss of identity. In fact, it may be the opposite. It shows that identity can survive enormous change. A community can absorb new ancestry without disappearing. A language can survive. A tradition can survive. A memory can survive. A name can survive. And that is one of the most beautiful parts of the Nubian story. The DNA does not tell us that Nubians were really something else. It tells us that the very idea of a single pure origin is the wrong question. The better question is this: how did all these different people become Nubian? That is a much deeper mystery, because identity is not created by DNA alone. It is created by memory, by family, by place, by language, by stories told to children, by food, by music, by rivers, by graves, by the names people refuse to forget, and perhaps most of all by survival. Think about what Nubia endured. Kingdoms rose, kingdoms fell, foreign armies came, religions changed, languages shifted, trade routes changed, the Nile itself changed. And in modern times, the construction of the Aswan High Dam transformed huge parts of traditional Nubian territory. Entire communities were forced to move. Villages disappeared beneath the waters of Lake Nasser. Ancient archaeological sites had to be rescued before they were lost. UNESCO organized a major international campaign to save monuments and archaeological material threatened by the rising waters. Among the discoveries preserved from this effort were the extraordinary Christian murals of Pharos, once a major Nubian center. Those paintings show kings, royal mothers, bishops, and religious figures. They reveal a Nubian society with its own Christian artistic world. And they remind us that Nubia did not vanish when ancient Kush disappeared. It changed. It adapted. It continued. So perhaps the biggest mistake is thinking of Nubia as something that happened in the distant past. Nubian history is not dead. It is still carried by living people, still spoken in languages, still remembered in family stories, still visible in traditions, still present along the Nile. And now, ancient DNA is helping connect some of those living stories to people who died more than 1,000 years ago. But there is one final mystery. If Nubians had ancestry connected to both African and northern populations, does that mean they were somehow caught between two worlds? No, that is another modern assumption. The Nile Valley was not a clean line separating Africa from the rest of the world. It was a meeting place, and Africa itself has never been isolated from the wider human story. People moved in and out of Africa for tens of thousands of years. The northeastern corner of the continent was one of the major bridges between Africa and Eurasia. Nubia sat directly inside that zone. So perhaps we should stop asking whether Nubians were African or something else. The evidence does not demand that choice. They were African people whose history included connections with neighboring regions. That is not a contradiction. It is normal human history. And the same lesson appears again and again when ancient DNA is used carefully. Populations are not photographs, they are rivers. They change as they move through time. One generation adds something, another loses something. A migration introduces new ancestry. A marriage connects two communities. A famine reduces a population. A war moves survivors. A trade route brings strangers together. And thousands of years later, scientists can sometimes see the pattern. That is what makes the Nubian DNA story so powerful. It does not destroy the old story completely. It makes the story bigger. It tells us that the Nubians were not simply a mysterious civilization south of Egypt. They were part of a huge human network. Their ancestors lived along the Nile. They built kingdoms. They traded. They fought. They worshipped. They loved, they raised children, they buried their dead, they moved across deserts and rivers, they met people from far away, and they left descendants. There is also something humbling about the fact that the DNA evidence we have today is still limited. Ancient Africa remains badly undersampled compared with many other parts of the world. Heat destroys DNA. Archaeological sites are threatened. Political instability can make fieldwork difficult. Many ancient remains have never been tested, and many questions remain unanswered. We do not yet have a complete genetic timeline of every Nubian kingdom. We cannot simply take the 66 people from Kulubnarti and use them as representatives of every Nubian who ever lived. That would be a mistake. They lived during one particular period in one particular part of Nubia. Other ancient communities may tell different stories. And that is exciting, because it means the story is not finished. Imagine what future discoveries could reveal. A genome from Kerma, a genome from an early Kushite cemetery, more individuals from Meroë, more samples from ancient southern Nubia, more people from the Christian kingdoms, more data from communities that lived before and after major migrations. Each new genome could change our understanding, not because science is failing, but because science is supposed to change when better evidence appears. That is the real lesson of ancient DNA. It does not give us permission to replace one simplistic story with another. It gives us a chance to ask better questions. And perhaps that is what the Nubians deserve most. Not another myth, not another argument over who gets to claim them, but a fuller story, a human story, a story where the Nile is not a border but a bridge, a story where cultures are not sealed boxes, a story where people can be both deeply rooted and connected to distant worlds, a story where ancestry is complicated without being confusing, and a story where identity is more than percentages on a DNA chart. Because imagine standing today on the banks of the Nile in Sudan. The sun is falling, the desert is turning gold, the river keeps moving. It has been moving for thousands of years. The same water passes through a landscape where farmers once worked, where kings once ruled, where armies marched, where churches once rang with prayers, where pyramids were raised, where children once played, where families buried their dead. And beneath that soil are people whose DNA is now helping us hear their voices again. They cannot tell us their names. They cannot correct every mistake historians have made. They cannot explain every migration, but they can tell us something. They were connected. They were changing. They were surviving, and they were never as simple as the labels placed on them centuries later. So when someone says the Nubians were just one ancient group, remember the DNA. When someone says they came from only one place, remember the Nile. When someone says their history began with Egypt, remember Kerma. When someone says Nubia disappeared after Kush, remember the Christian kingdoms. And when someone tries to reduce an entire people to a percentage, remember that every percentage came from a person, a mother, a father, a child, a traveler, a farmer, a ruler, a stranger, someone who lived an entire human life and never imagined that thousands of years later, scientists would search their bones for answers. That may be the deepest truth hidden in the DNA. The Nubians were not never what we thought, because they secretly belonged to some completely different people. They were never as simple as we imagined. Their story was always bigger. It stretched from the African interior to Egypt and beyond. It crossed kingdoms and religions. It crossed wars and migrations. It survived political collapse. It survived cultural change. And in some form, it survived into the present. The ancient DNA does not erase Nubian identity. It gives us a deeper reason to understand it. Because identity is not weakened by a complicated past. Sometimes a complicated past is exactly what makes a people remarkable, and perhaps that is why the Nile still feels mysterious. It carries water through the desert, but it also carries memory. Kingdom after kingdom disappears, names fade, stone breaks, tombs are buried, languages change. But the river keeps moving, and now hidden inside ancient bones, another current has appeared. A genetic current, a record of people meeting people, of families joining families, of Africa connecting with the wider ancient world, of a civilization that was never standing still. So the next time you see a Nubian pyramid rising from the Sudanese desert, do not see only an ancient monument. See the people behind it. Do not see only a kingdom. See generations. Do not see only DNA. See human lives. Because the greatest discovery may not be that the Nubians had a complicated ancestry. We already know human history is complicated. The greatest discovery is that after thousands of years, they are still leaving clues behind. And perhaps that is the final mystery. How much of our story is still buried beneath the sand? How many forgotten people are still waiting for science to hear them? And how many histories that seem finished are actually still being written? The Nubians left us pyramids. They left us temples. They left us cities. They left us paintings. They left us stories. And now they have left us something even quieter. A message written not in stone, but in DNA. It says that the past was never as clean as the stories we tell about it. Human beings have always moved, always met, always changed, always carried pieces of one another into the future. And somewhere along the Nile, thousands of years ago, that future began taking shape. We are only now learning how to read it.